Okay, this morning we are going to talk about answering critiques, and this is going to be a pretty broad overview with some details about different speeches and different tactics that you want to use kind of throughout a critique debate. Come on in. What's your name? Oh, looks like we maybe got everyone. Oh, except Aliana, did you make it, Aliana? Okay. So I'll start with some big picture thoughts about answering critiques and then talk through the 1AC through the 2AR when debating critique arguments. So first, sorry, this room is a little bit smaller than I think it wanted to be. I apologize that you have to sit on the floor. I have 4 thoughts about the big picture of answering critiques, and they are as follows. One is defend your business. So zooming out a little bit, what a critique argument is a criticism of the assumptions of the affirmative. And so you need to be prepared to defend those assumptions. That is, number one overall important factor for debating critiques is defending what you have said in the 1AC. So this requires thinking about your AF in relation to critical arguments, particularly the critical arguments that are most directly applicable or most likely to apply to your AF that clash with the things that your AF says. So if you read an advantage about the economy, I would probably think about your relationship and intention toward answering critiques of economic rationality and of capitalism and of neoliberalism. If your 1AC is oriented around a China war, I would want to be prepared and think about critiques of representations of China and of strategic thought related to warfare. If you read an affirmative that is a little bit narrower and says that the federal government should do something to stop, a set of harms that is about colonialism or about racism, I would think about your relationship in your affirmative in relationship to a set of structural critiques that say that use of the federal government is inherently problematic. So the style of affirmative you read will open up a set of critical literature that is most directly clash with your AF, and you want to think about your AF in relationship to that literature as early as possible. Second overall concept is have a strategy. So we will talk about kind of 2 distinct approaches to AFK strategy and when and how to kind of deploy each of them, or when you might be more likely to use one than the other. And you want to be sure that you have chosen or have an idea of which of those approaches is most conducive to your approach to debating critiques. And the 2, we'll go into more detail about this, but the 2 kind of meta approaches to debating critiques are 1, impact turning, or saying that the critique is fundamentally wrong and backward in its assumptions, and the 1AC is valuable even in relationship to the things that the negative has problematized. Or 2, a more permutation-oriented strategy that says, we think that the AF is not that far off from the ultimate political objectives of this critique. And we think that the 1AC can be combined with the critique alternative and be productive. And that strategy also relies on winning that the alternative itself is not as effective a political strategy as the AF or the permutation. Third meta concept for debating critiques is to always use the blueprint, and we will talk through the blueprint in detail when we get to the 2AC, but there's a set of arguments that you want to make in every kind of critique debate, and making sure that your 2AC has that set of arguments means that you're following the blueprint, which sets you up for a successful implementation of whatever strategy you choose later on. Fourth big picture concept, and we are going to talk about this in a bunch more depth, is just don't drop tricks. So a lot of critique debates are won and lost on one team making and the other team not answering some tricky kind of like little bomb that the negative has dropped in the block usually, and the AF failing to respond to it. So we'll talk about what those are and how to beat them, but not dropping tricks is a big picture concept that you want to think about. So to get into the more nitty-gritty details, debating critiques begins with writing a good 1AC. So you want to be able to defend everything that you say in the 1AC. You want to have a strong, rigorous defense of the research assumptions, the epistemological foundations of your argument, the primary authors that you read. You want to have the ability to say, we have chosen these things for good reasons, And those good reasons are going to form the basis of generating offense against any critical argument that might be made. So what does this entail specifically? I would have at least one advantage argument that you feel confident defending: the internal links, the representations, the research methodology, and the impacts. So sometimes people will orient the advantage that they want to read around the impact argument that they want to make, because they feel that certain threats that we face are, legitimately so important that they ought to orient our politics and thus provide a basis for defense against critiques. So global warming is an example that you'll often hear that people like to read if they think that they're going to have debates against critiques. And kind of the reasons for that being a very defensible impact is that it's definitely a real problem. It is scientifically oriented. It does not require, for example, the field of IR, which is heavily criticized. Climate change is caused by humans, and it is very obvious that only human action can reverse it. The impact evidence is usually highly qualified. There are social justice aspects to the ways in which warming disproportionately affects certain people. There are lots of reasons that people often choose warming as kind of the locus for their critique 1AC, or their 1AC aimed at answering critiques. On this topic, I would think about inequality as a possible impact along these lines, because I think that the resolution is well set up to provide you with mechanisms to deal with inequality. You can make kind of very direct interventions in what is unequal about our existing processes and systems of distribution, fiscal distribution. Definitely, the impact evidence about inequality is very qualified and good quality, and it's definitely the people who talk about wanting to intervene in structures of inequality interact directly with many critique authors and, say that big federal action is important for resolving that kind of thing. So that is an area that I would expect some people to go on this topic as their kind of K1AC focus. It is useful often in these debates to consolidate. So you don't necessarily need kind of, 3 or 4 advantages if your debate is going to be about a critique. It is more likely to hurt you than help you if you have made advantage arguments that you don't really feel like you can defend. So I would consolidate your 1AC to only what you feel good about defending. There is also, the option of reading an entirely different affirmative against teams that you think are likely to go for a critique, but you should be aware and cognizant of the further you get out of the core area of your expertise around what you have studied and what you have researched heavily, the more likely there are to be unexpected critiques in that literature that you maybe aren't as prepared for. So just be aware anytime you're choosing and selecting and constructing your 1AC for K debates that you are aware that the more that you branch out, the more different literature there is. The more likely a team is to go for critiques, the more you want to tailor your 1AC around these things. And again, like I said, you don't need kind of advantage arguments or superfluous impacts that you can't defend effectively. And then the last kind of AF construction thing is that once you have identified what your AF is about, start writing your 2AC blocks to critiques. You want to have blocks, all of your critique blocks should be specific to the 1AC that you plan to read, while also being modularized to different kinds of critiques. So, critiques of neoliberalism, various pessimisms, critiques around representations, these all require their own set of blocks. And you should also have short and long versions of these blocks, because it is in some debates, you will have debates where the 1AC is all a critique. In other debates, a critique will be one option in a more varied negative strategy. And you want to be able to read your blocks in ways that correspond to the length that you need. So that is 1AC construction. Questions about any of that or what we've talked about so far? Yeah.
So as far as a blueprint, is this a blueprint that you would follow in any narrative of constructing a critique, or would you use this in the same narrative of a critique AF?
The blueprint that I am talking about is one that you would use on the AF responding to critiques. And it would be in every 2AC that you give against a critique. And that is, we will get to exactly what that blueprint looks like very soon. So the next kind of phase in debating a critique is the 1NC. So as the 1 and C happens, it is very important to get grounded in what the argument is and what it is trying to be. You want to have as clear as possible a vision for what the argument is and how you're going to respond to it as early as possible. And that requires a rigorous reading through starting with reading through the 1 and C cards and pulling out concepts and assumptions. And then it requires a rigorous cross-section of the 1 and C. So if you are confused about what a critique is saying or arguing, the cross-section is an important time to clarify that and to figure out what it is that it's actually saying. So any confusion that you have about the critique should be something that you clear up as quickly as possible without allowing the negative to kind of spend too much time explaining their argument in ways that are not conducive to your understanding. But you need to find out what the alternative does and what world it operates in. So alternatives look different and they kind of act in different ways depending upon the orientation of the critique. So does the alternative just reject the AF? Does it align with some sort of social movement? Does it reject certain portions of the 1AC? Does it take issue with the federal government and burn it down? Try to get as specific an alternative text as possible. So usually you'll identify an alternative in the tag to the alternative card in the 1 and C, but you want to figure out if that is what they are going to defend. You want to get a description of the alternative as early as possible and as specific as possible so that you can be on top of any ways in which it morphs or shifts throughout the debate. If asking questions about the alternative should also tell you how heavily and to what degree you need to invest in a framework argument or an argument about how the judge should evaluate the AF in comparison to the alternative or in comparison to the critique. And we'll talk more about framework in a minute. But identifying how the alternative works and how it operates is one step toward figuring out what kind of framework argument you might want to make. It can be useful, depending on how AF inclusive the critique seems, it can be useful to find out early on in this cross-ex whether the alternative can result in the plan or not. So if the critique is one that is, we reject this particular representation of the 1AC, but we otherwise endorse the idea of the 1AC, that is AF inclusive. You want to figure that out early on because it is, again, going to influence the framework argument you make and the theoretical arguments you're going to make against the alternative. Other issues to identifying cross-ex include their primary link arguments and what they are oriented around. So are they about what the plan does? Are they about the discourse or the representations of the advantages? Are they about the reliance upon and use of the federal government? So your permutation arguments and alternative debating will need to be oriented around the specificities of the link arguments. And so asking questions about the links is a good way of getting at the arguments that you're going to need to make. The one way of thinking about critiques that can be useful sometimes and can also not be, whatever. I'm just going to show you my sliding scale. So the way that I think about critiques in terms of their alternative arguments is on a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, we have what we might call a rejection alternative that is based around we reject the 1AC. The strength of an alternative that says reject the 1AC, what is the strength of an alternative that just rejects the 1AC? Go ahead. It is very difficult to permute. And at the other end of the spectrum, I would describe alternatives about social movements as residing at the other end of the spectrum. Now, this end of the spectrum is maybe easier to permute. So a social movement, it is not that difficult for the AF to say the AF is compatible with this particular movement. It is an easy case to make that we could both, endorse the 1AC, follow the logic of the 1AC, agree with the 1AC, and also buy into or orient ourselves toward a particular social movement. So at a face level, more vulnerable to the permutation. What is the strength, the comparative strength of a movement or an alternative that is more oriented around movements, or what could one strength be? Go ahead.
Well, there's a better chance of solving it.
Yeah, exactly. So solves better. Solves the links and the impacts better. That's the strength, and the weakness is easy to permute. And the weakness here is maybe doesn't solve as well. So obviously this is not directly targeted at a particular cross-X strategy because you can't exactly say where on the spectrum are you, but you can definitely ask questions that get at how does the alternative operate and how, what is it attempting to solve and how? Oh my God, this is a disaster. I quit. Okay. And then the final kind of genre that you want to be on the lookout for in the cross-X of the 1NC is the impact. So what is the impact of the critique? Are they relying upon an impact framing debate? Like, is the impact around something like value to life that will require them to say it outweighs extinction? Is it an ethics-based argument? Do they claim to result in extinction? So figure out what kinds of cards you need to read to answer the impact. The 2AC and the blueprint is the next section. Any questions about that cross-X or any of that? So every 2AC should include the following components. A permutation. We will talk in more depth about permutations and how they, operate and how they're useful. But the obvious function and goal of a permutation is to say that the 1AC is compatible with the alternative. And I think that the best permutation arguments demonstrate that the alternative is not mutually exclusive with the AF. And part of the reason that I said it is useful to get a specific alternative text, right, is that designing your permutation can incorporate what the alternative actually is. So I think it is worth writing a specific permutation text after the 1NC that includes the part of the alternative that they think solves the critique. And another benefit to doing this is to demonstrate, one, to what degree there is mutual exclusivity, how is the alternative inconsistent with the 1AC? And then two, as a corollary to that, where do you want to generate offense? So for example, a 1NC alternative says call for the end of America. If we were to do the plan and call for the end of America, what would we have to generate offense on based on the fact that the plan uses America? We would have to say that the end of America was bad, right? That's where we have to get offense if the alternative cannot coexist with the 1AC. Or a security critique 1NC might say rejects the 1AC's security discourse or security rhetoric. The permutation could say do the plan and reject security discourse. The offense there would need to be the security discourse in the 1AC is good. So the parts of the 1AC that are not compatible with the permutation are where you want to start generating offense. The alternative in the capitalism critique generic at camp is uncompromising revolutionary stance against the universality of racial capitalism. So our permutation might be do the plan and take an uncompromising revolutionary stance against the universality of racial capitalism. Where do you all think that a 1AC or an AF team that says permutation and says that permutation, where might offense need to be generated, depending on the AF that you're reading? Yeah. Yeah, so the part of the 1AC that relies upon, the utilization or the implementation of capitalist discourses or ideologies, whatever part of the 1AC is not permutable because it is incompatible with the end of capitalism, right? That climate change is a good example. That might be where we generate offense because that is where there is clash. Does that kind of make sense to people? Second thought about the permutation, I am a fan of a 2AC that makes a few different permutations to force block time. So, some teams will answer permutations differently depending on how it's worded. And I think that the negative really should answer permutations differently depending on how they're phrased. Some will not, and will just answer them all kind of at the same time. But that may open the gates for you to say, actually, this permutation was different and requires a different set of responses. Here are the ways in which this permutation is distinct. So I'm a fan of a few different permutations in the 2AC. The only permutation that I don't like is do the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative, because I think that's just a description of what a permutation is. So I don't think you're getting anything out of that. Keep in mind that permutations will often serve primarily as a link shield. So the permutation in many worlds solves some or the worst aspects of the criticism with the net benefit of also solving the affirmative. And the reason I bring that up is that I would stop thinking in most debates that you can win a link turn or a no link to critiques. It is very difficult to do. The place that critiques tend to be the strongest is in the link. And so the AF winning, there isn't any link, is very unlikely. But if there are ways in which you think the link is small or can be mitigated or is narrow, that is a way that the permutation, that to bolster the permutation. So start thinking about no link or link turn arguments in terms of a permutation. Second component of the blueprint is what most people call framework. It is sometimes also called the role of the ballot. It can be phrased different ways, but an argument about what the judge should evaluate at the end of the debate. And your end goal in making an argument about this in the 2AC is to be able to weigh the affirmative or the 1AC against the critique and make your impact arguments, the things you have said in the 1AC, matter. The AF can rarely win a critique debate if the implementation of the plan is not a relevant consideration. I would keep in mind that you are not trying, your ultimate goal in making an argument about this is not to get the judge to reject critiques, but to consider the consequences of the plan and compare them to the alternative. That being said, I think it is fine if you want to make a very stringent framework interpretation in the 2AC, as long as you know that you're probably going to meet the negative somewhere in the middle by the end of the debate. There's a whole bunch of different, justifications for you should consider the impacts and the consequences of the 1AC in your decision making. I think that the reciprocity is one of the maybe better arguments in favor of many framework interpretations, because the resolution poses a constraint on the AF, and the 1AC ought to pose a constraint on the negative for some level of reciprocity. So you want to the argument that you want to make would be that only your interpretation enables that form of reciprocity that facilitates direct clash, and also most times people will make fairness impacts to this, which is fine. Be aware that the negatives framework argument is likely going to be focused on impacts that are beyond and broader than the debate. So you are going to have to do some impact comparison that assumes our impacts are about debate itself, your impacts are about broader structures. The next component of the blueprint is alternative solvency presses. And there are two levels of alternative solvency arguments that you want to make. The first is the alternative doesn't solve its impact arguments. So the alternative cannot overcome the broad-based, sweeping link and impact claims that it has made in the 1NC. So if you think about something like neoliberalism and how pervasive and entrenched it is, how likely is it that globalization from below or radical democratic movements are actually able to overcome these structures? So the alternative doesn't solve its own impact. Second, the alternative doesn't solve the case. It is important to have an argument in the 2AC that identifies why the alternative is not able to solve the impacts isolated to the 1AC. And this is usually a pretty easy argument to make insofar as the 1AC has staked out some pretty specific impact and internal link claims and then has presented 8 minutes of evidence in favor of the proposed mechanism to deal with those things. And the alternative and the critique are unlikely to rise to that level of specificity or directly speak to the case itself. If the alternative, on the other hand, is AF inclusive, then it is certainly more likely to solve the case. We're likely going to have to win a theoretical objection to AF inclusivity as a component of the critique. So be aware that if the alternative encompasses the AF, you have a theory debate on your hands. Next category in the blueprint is offense against the alternative. The 2AC wants to generate offense. There are a few ways of accomplishing this. First and best is defending what you have said. So the best offense comes from defense, the defense of the things you have said in the 1AC. So this is why I talked about writing the affirmative and advantages, where you can say that our decisions or going into these things are good, that you can say it is good to talk about disease in this particular way. It is good to kind of incorporate rhetoric that securitizes about this particular issue. It is, neoliberalism is necessary to resolve the impacts that we have identified. So how can the 1AC provide offense? Use as much as possible as you can from the 1AC. Another form of offense that sometimes can be useful is an argument about seeding the political. This argument says that in the absence of strong kind of progressive actions, usually policy actions, the political sphere will be taken over by the far right, who will, behave in destructive and damaging ways. This is a useful category of argument because it functions as a solvency takeout and a disadd to the alternative, and it can be another justification for a permutation. The only problem is this can be overused. So people, there was a kind of a while when people started to say see the political in all their critique 2ACs, and it would be like, well, the alternative is let's say the neoliberalism alternative is explicitly political. It aligns with this set of movements. That doesn't see the political. So there's not a good link to that style of alternative. But there are many critiques that are either explicitly anti-political or that you can generate links based on use of the state or based on use of particular market structures, etc. So you do need to read link arguments and link evidence rather than just making an assertion that the alternative sees the political. It can be helpful to read through. This is where you want to get some familiarity with critique authors, because if you read through their work, you can identify links to see the political through figuring out what that person stands for. The next category of offense against the alternative, critiques like neoliberalism and capitalism are oriented around concrete socio-political movements. You can find offense based on those movements being problematic or causing other bad problems. I think any critique that is oriented around a pessimism, there's lots of good literature about why pessimist positions are anti-radical and self-defeating. So that is a good place to generate offense. Keep in mind that all arguments you make that are about the critique itself should be phrased offensively. So rather than saying the critique author is wrong or the alternative fails, rephrase those arguments into offensive reasons the alternative is bad. Last component of the blueprint in the 2AC is impact defense. So you need to minimize the impact to the 1NC's critique just the same way that you do with a disadd. Most critiques or many critiques will have impact framing arguments. So the 2AC impact defense sets up your answers to those arguments. There's a few kind of varieties of impact defense that can be useful against critiques. So one is like a generic, there are political and economic institutions that prevent genocide or prevent, endless wars or first striking other countries. Second is like a uniqueness argument. If you are debating neoliberalism or capitalism and you're having a debate about whether the world is structurally getting better or worse, a 2AC can read impact defense by saying, all the things that their evidence says capitalism causes are actually declining. So poverty is declining, environmental protections are increasing, structural violence is declining. So saying that the system that you are defending is actually working to resolve those impacts is a form of impact defense. Against most pessimist critiques, I would want a card that says positive social change is possible and has happened. And I would want that card to include examples of when and how that has worked. And then the last category I have here is just answering root cause arguments. So anytime that the critique says our impact or our link arguments are the root cause of all the problems in the world, then we want to say that the F is not the root cause. The F is obviously not responsible for all interventionism or all neoliberal violence. So explanations of why there are other factors that contribute to those impacts should be combined with alternative solvency takeouts to minimize the impact to the critique. And my last thought about the impact defense stuff is you can often make these arguments analytically. So it is useful to have a card, but it does not necessarily require a card in the 2AC. A lot of the arguments I just talked about can certainly be made analytically, and you can read cards later if you want to. Questions about the blueprint or about the 2AC? Yeah.
You were saying something about neoliberalism and capitalism are don't compete systems. Can you elaborate on that?
I think that was about the point I was making there was that when you're trying to get offense against the alternative, some critiques like capitalism and neoliberalism have like concrete social, trajectories attached to them, such as we should move in the direction of socialism or we should move in the direction of communism. Those are easy to get offense about because there's lots of literature about those kinds of orientations or movements. Does that make sense? Emerson.
You said that we should phrase all of our key arguments like offensively. Could you give a few examples of that?
Yeah, so instead of saying, like, you might cut a card that's like, Bataille is wrong, right? But instead of tagging that Bataille is wrong in the 2AC, I would want to tag that, the theory of the general economy produces suffering, or their theory, results in takeover by fascists, or whatever it is that you can make the card say that is offensive. I would tag it in that way. I think I saw Brandon's hand next.
Do you remember repeating, so you mentioned something about how, like, app is never really the root cause of everything. Do you remember repeating that part? That's fine.
Yeah, so the AF is obviously not responsible for every bad thing that ever happened in the world. I think that is a very defensible claim. You want to explain why there are other factors that contribute to those impacts or that result in those things. And you want to have a defense of the idea of proximate causes, or there are, more specific direct things that trigger these impacts more directly and more concretely than the broader structures. Yeah.
How do you have no specific kind of credible authorization to write certain things on certain topics? How do you kind of decredit that ideology? Because,
Well,
for example, with Ty, kind of knowing that he has no credible stance on writing anything on the economic state of the U.S. and things like that. How do you kind of decredit people taking his ideology?
Usually it's from research. So like, I think you can make the argument that, like, Bataille, for example, has no credibility on the economics inner workings of the United States. But I would also want to do some research on what are the reasons that, other scholars disagree with this person and think that this person's ideology is problematic, right? So you can kind of research, regardless of how credible you think that person is, someone is going to disagree with that person. And then that's where you want to generate offense. Yeah. I think it really depends on both the mechanism of the plan and the advantage arguments that you've chosen. So if you read like a big growth advantage, I would probably want to go for just it is good. If your AF is a little bit more targeted and a little bit narrower, then you might be able to win a more, regulated capitalism solves, we reform it kind of thing. But it is constrained by the advantage ground that you choose. Yeah. So I like the permutation that is, do the plan and then language of the alternative. Like, it is just a more wordy way of saying do both, but I think it gets at the idea that the AF and the alternative are not incompatible, that they are not mutually exclusive, that they can be combined. I think it helps highlight that for the judge because on paper, you can figure out why those two things would be compatible. Yeah.
Can you go over the examples of the permutations that you said earlier, like the defense of like the securitization of the 1AC?
Okay, so what I said was if the 1NC alternative says reject the securitizing discourse of the 1AC, you need offense for the securitizing discourse of the 1AC. And then I said if the 1NC alternative is call for the end of America and you want to permute, your offense has to come from the end of America is bad. And then I gave a confusing example about the Cap K alternative that I don't think really illustrated anything because I think it really depends on what 1AC you've read in that context.
In the current, critique that we're going against, we're kind of defending this narrative that, giving essentially, it's against the side argument saying that we should give our economy as a gift to other people.
Mhm.
And so basically they're essentially going for like a depreciation of the economy in a sense, or a dev type of argument.
The negative is,
Correct.
uh-huh.
And so how would you kind of like counteract that narrative of, would you say that US hedge good? Because that's the first thing that came to my mind, kind of saying that US hegemony or being the hegemon is kind of like an equalized balance of the economy, and kind of destabilizing that would lead to some sort of impact. I haven't really gotten to the narrative.
I think that would be a great strategy. The like hedge good stuff would be a really good strategy if your 1AC is compatible with it. So if your 1AC, you know, has stakes out advantage ground that is concerned with kind of big stick impacts kind of thing. If your 1AC is, you know, more critical, then I probably wouldn't say hedge good in the 2AC. Yeah. Yes, so I said the alternative solvency presses need 2 levels. One is the alternative doesn't solve its impacts. And you want to say like, that's where you might make a pretty generic argument about here's the like sweeping or totalizing nature of their link claims. The alternative is not sufficient to overcome that. Or, and second, the alternative doesn't solve the case. And here is why.
You said something about a theoretical.
I said if the critique alternative is AF inclusive, so if it could result in the affirmative, or says, yeah, our alternative encompasses the things that the 1AC endorses, then you have to make a theoretical objection that says alternatives cannot include the F. Yeah.
In the example earlier, would the permutation be like the securitizing discourse of the 1AC specifically is good and reject instances of securitization in other ways?
Okay, so I think those are 2 different permutations. One is, you know, basically do both and says, to the extent that you cannot both endorse the 1AC and endorse the alternative because the alternative rejects securitizing discourse, the examples that they have cited that are in the 1AC are good.
Yeah.
And then the second permutation I think that you described there was, you know, do the 1AC and reject other securitizing discourse, or reject securitization discourse in every other instance, or just broadly reject security discourse. So it's just a version of do both. It's like endorse the 1AC or do the plan and reject the securitizing discourse of the 1AC that they have problematized.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Remember to cross-ex the 2NC if the 2NC extends the critique. This is a place where I would ask a lot more questions about the alternative. I would want to get a lot of examples of what the alternative looks like in practice, or what we think the alternative promotes or produces. Often the examples that are given will be permutable. So the more that you can get the negative to say, here are some examples of policies or ways of thinking that we would endorse according to the alternative, a lot of those examples will be things that you can say, we perm that, we do that too. Why not? We'll take that on. So like the, you know, a capitalism critique alternative that, you know, is oriented around revolutionary organizing. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like in practice? Do you hold rallies? We will hold rallies too. Like, does the, what kinds of economic decisions would the alternative make, and how would it distribute, you know, goods in society? We would do that too, or we can do that too. So cross-ex the 2NC to try to get at ways in which the alternative as described can be permuted. It is also useful, or can be useful depending on your set of arguments, to ask questions about sort of the mechanism for alternative solvency. So how does the alternative change people's minds? If it is the case that, you know, most people are pretty, you know, rooted in capitalist ideology and pretty well wedded to that system, how does the alternative go about changing those people's minds? And that can help you either with a permutation or with alternative solvency arguments. The 1AR. The 1AR is the time to begin pivoting to decide whether you're going more for an impact turn strategy or for a permutation strategy. You need to know what the 2AR wants to go for and what the final AF strategy against the critique is going to be at the end of the debate. That being said, I do think there's a couple arguments that should be in every 1AR against a critique, regardless of what the plan is for the 2AR, which are the AF should be considered, the AF matters, that whole framework thing. The alternative doesn't solve, coupled ideally with your offense, and a permutation in some form. And I may be a little bit out of the norm on this in that I think a permutation should be in the 1AR against every critique, even if you're going for an impact turn. That is purely tactical on my part. I think that most 2NRs will have difficulty dispensing with a permutation efficiently. And so having it there costs the 2NR some time that you can get back. When debating framework or the impact assessment evaluation part of the debate, pay attention to how the block debates this. So lots of blocks will read evidence. When they read evidence that X, Y, or Z is the most important consideration in policy analysis, that those cards are often very good on this consideration is important. They will often not be very good on this should be prioritized to the exclusion of everything else. So a card on framework that says XYZ comes first should not be presumed to say only this thing matters. So if we read a card that's like, you have to assess the neoliberal foundations of any policy before implementing it, and here's why, that card is not going to say the consequences of that policy do not matter. So in defending your framework interpretation, be responsive to the evidence that they've read. I said you want to be responsive to the evidence that has been read. Really quickly, we're going to go through some K tricks that ought not to be dropped in the 1AR. First is any AF inclusive critique or floating pick. So anywhere that the block has said we can endorse the AF except for this should raise giant red flags that you need to make a theory argument. This is what we were just talking about in the 1AR. Second trick, fiat not real. The argument that you want to make here is like, obviously, and no one thinks that it is, but it is useful to imagine, like your framework argument already has to be defending the utility of imagining a hypothetical world in which the plan happened. And so explaining why that is true or why that is valuable defeats fiat is not real, which is just an FYI. Turns case. So almost every critique block will include some form of turns case arguments. A couple of examples are root cause. We kind of already talked about this one, but winning that you are able to resolve some proximate impact should be sufficient, and you do not need to resolve every instance. And we want to kind of push back against the whole premise that there can be a universal explanation for all violence or all problems. Another example of a turns case argument is serial policy failure. Who knows what serial policy failure is? Emerson.
The idea is that the way that the app operates, like maybe it's security logic, means that your policy specifically will fail, and then because you're like staying within this paradigm of securitization or whatever they're critiquing, that all policy will continue to fail for that reason.
Right. So the things that we problematized about the 1AC will continue to reproduce these impacts. Your policies, they fail. This is a place to use your specific 1AC solvency evidence because they might have some general evidence about error replication, but it is, unless the turns case argument is particularly nuanced, they're unlikely to have evidence to the effect that it actually turns your particular 1AC. Reps first, epistemology first, ontology first, ethics first is the next bucket of tricks. A lot of times these arguments appear on framework. I think all of them probably call for a card. Next is threat construction. So your authors are liars or they have incentives to exaggerate and make shit up. to sustain their mission of whatever thing is their critique is about. Obviously, you have to defend and win that your impacts are correct, and winning a broader thesis claim about how the world operates, having a well-constructed 1AC that has a defense of your theory of how the world operates will be very useful here. Next is value to life or some iteration of social death. So, the kind of concept that the system perpetuated by the 1AC's problems are so bad that people might as well not be alive, or, their lives are ruined, or, social death is the argument that people are always already kind of excluded from life. Your answers, should generally be there is always value to life, and that should be an individual subjective determination rather than a decision made by someone else. And the last trick that I have written down is predictions fail and or there's no capital T truth. So something like your predictions, like people are really bad at prognosticating and predicting the world. So the things that you have said will happen in the 1AC are unlikely to happen, or they're wrong, or you won't be able to solve them. Again, if you have particular specific evidence that defends your predictions, you should be in a pretty good spot. And then for the existence of capital T truth, like, again, you probably want to defend that there is some, tangible truth in the world that we can all kind of get behind. And even if there isn't, or even if that doesn't exist, the reality that we live in means that we should pretend in order to maintain some semblance of political stability and prevent everything from devolving into chaos. Any other K tricks that I missed? Emerson. Sure. So mostly it's pretty contextual. So a lot of Emerson has identified that a lot of framework 2NCs or 1NRs are structured around, they will like answer your interpretation, and then they'll be like, here's a bunch of DAs to your interpretation. I would answer those directly. Usually they are some version of a link to the broader critique. So they are usually some version of like your way of representing and caring and thinking about impacts or about policy planning. It is a broader link to our, thesis about, whether it's neoliberalism or whether it's about post-reality or whatever. And so to some degree, anywhere that you have a thesis claim that directly disagrees with that premise, you can cross-apply that. You can also, like, again, it really depends on the details of, are these disads that are like, the Karl Rove disad that policy debaters turn into evil people. Like, you have to answer that just on the basics of like, no, it doesn't. Debate doesn't over-determine subjectivity. Karl Rove was Karl Rove for many reasons, and being a policy debater did not make him that way. So you got to kind of directly combat whatever it is that they're saying. But usually it's a lot of, fancy words or smoke and mirrors to like waste your time. So be efficient in cutting through the noise. Yeah. So that was what we were just talking about, where the idea is that if your policy is predicated on problematic assumptions, it will inevitably fail. It will not solve, it will reproduce its own impacts. And we want to say, the specificity of our solvency evidence overcomes this. We are able to resolve particular impacts and issues, even if we can't solve everything ever. Yes. What theory argument? Which one?
Like a defense of.
I'm not sure what you mean.
I'm not sure what I mean, but I guess like, I guess the question I'm really asking is how do you make a theory argument, but also how would you defend it against a theory argument? That's the only way I can like put that into words.
Sure. I think that debating theory is like a broader elective that I would want to learn about, kind of just like how theory arguments operate. But in general, the premise of a theory argument is like something that the other team has done, or the way that they have constructed their argument is unfair or anti-educational. Here is why, and here is why that's bad. It's a lot. It operates a lot like D. Yeah.
Oh.
Brandon. Okay, Parker.
Like advice on answering like you win, you lose arguments.
Oh yeah, I think that those it is very easy to win that model and that logic is really flawed because it is the ultimate form of purity politics that throws the baby out with the bathwater. It says that any marginal problem is a reason to wholesale reject, things that make the world a better place, and endorsing that model is, a politically problematic. I actually think that is a great way to leverage offense if that is how they're phrasing it. Dogmatism is another word I would throw in there. Produces dogmatism. Other questions? Brandon.
So you mentioned something about how like if the K is like kind of like app, like it encompasses what the app is trying to say. Like how is there like a specific way how we would format like the theory argument rather than just saying like
Half inclusive critiques are a voting issue, and then give 2 to 3 reasons why they're bad. 1, make it impossible for the AF to generate offense, which means the AF can never win. 2, undermine clash because there is no way to debate against yourself. Yeah.
For a permutation, you think valuable like rehalling faults, so like areas that doesn't include like injecting the YC.
I think so. Yeah. If you can find places in their evidence that are directly supportive of a permutation or that can be directly articulated as part of your permutation, I think that's useful. Okay, I have a couple quick thoughts about the 2AR and then we'll be done. Ideally, the 1AR will have set up the 2AR strategy. So you should know what you plan to go for based on what the 1AR has set up. Second, I would always want to have a checklist for the 2AR of arguments that you cannot drop or must make or cannot or must answer. And this is a good place for the 1A and the 2A to have a conversation because sometimes one person will have caught something that the other person hasn't caught. And I would like literally write on a piece of paper, a separate piece of paper, like here are the arguments we are going to make sure to answer. Keep in mind the blueprint that you set up in the 2AC, like that has all the pieces that you need to defeat any critique. And then don't forget the 1AC. So thinking all the way back, we structured and constructed the 1AC in a way that directly we think defeats critique arguments in some way or another. And we want to use those pieces in the 2AR as much as possible. Those are my mind-blowing 2AR thoughts. Most of this lecture is about the other parts. Questions? Yeah.
So when do you think you can like definitely know that this is the way that you want to go? Like in which argument?
Mostly, I think that is a pre-debate decision. So I think it is based on the 1AC that like the 2AR that is best set up by your 1AC is the one I would plan to give. So I would want to know whether that is the impact turn strategy or the permutation strategy at the outset. And then some of that can be, filtered or modified by what happens in the debate, but a lot of it is a pre-debate decision.
Okay, but you as a judge, like if you were what narrative would you want?
I just want a narrative that is consistent with the 1AC. I don't really care that much. I'm not picky. Yeah.
2AC, what should the order? Framework, alt, and then like a proper, or like the other way around?
Best arguments to worst arguments.
Okay.
And I'm on a bit of a mission along with some other people to get the 2AC to stop saying framework first. Callahan's here for it. I got a bunch of reasons. 1, it's really hard to flow. When it's the first thing that you're saying, I'm going to miss a bunch of it. 2, it is not your best argument. It is like a very defensive thing about like how I shouldn't just throw out the 1AC. Your best argument ought to be, here's why your critique is wrong and bad, and we already impact turned it, or we already set up a permutation. Like those things are your better arguments. Framework is just something you like have to do. So like put it lower, in my opinion. Yeah.
Would be the best way to like counteract, I guess, broader alts, or do you think that they should be specific arguments?
I think it depends. So like if your 1AC it is in conversation with the critique that they're going for and directly beats it or answers it, then I think there is a lot of room for our 1AC. Here's how the case answers this. And we're going to do a lot of cross application. If your 1AC doesn't have that much to say about the critique, then you're going to have to focus on, here's the set of things that we have said in the 2AC or here's a set of arguments against this critique that are then presented for the first time in the 2AC, and then maybe the 1AC is a little bit less cross applicable. Yeah. Okay, well, I would say psychoanalysis sucks, to answer psychoanalysis. Like, lots of good cards on this is a really bad analytic for thinking about the world, and certainly for thinking about political decision making. What I don't know what you mean about targeting the debaters.
Like, it doesn't matter about the one that's like, at least from my understanding, I might be wrong, the psychos will like, the desire will like be built when we read the one that's.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so again, I think that targeting the psychoanalysis as a locus for politics is a great way to generate offense against that. And that, you know, that means that your 1AC is still relevant insofar as you can, you know, demonstrate or win in front of the judge that it still matters. So that's like the framework debate, and that's a whole kind of separate thing. But I think that, you know, this is a bad locus for politics is a good argument. And then anything, this is not exactly your question, but it is, I think, relevant. So any critique argument that is about something that is not, you know, is the 1AC a good idea? That can be part of your framework argument for why moving the decision that the judge is making away from that is bad. Okay, I should let you go because you have another elective. Thank you all for coming.